to start. Welcome to the last Buechner Institute lecture with Marilyn McEntyre. We are pleased to see you here, and we treasure your attendance, our shared interests, and your friendship. On this day in history, some terrible things happened, I'm sorry to tell you. You may remember the tragic school shooting at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado in 1999. And many years before that, in 1914, also in Colorado, National Guardsmen attacked a tent colony of striking coal miners near Ludlow. At first, the strikers thought the Guardsmen were there to protect them, but it soon became apparent that the federal troops were actually hired by the Rockefeller family who owned the mines. 66 men, women, and little children were killed, but no one was ever charged for their murders. In a world sometimes dark with injustice, perhaps we must lift our eyes to the mountains and ask, from where does my help come? Sometimes it comes from those wise with words and endowed with grace. Our speaker is one of those people, and very importantly, so is her introducer, Dr. Craig McDonald. We are lucky to have them both with us tonight.
Late in his life, President John Adams wrote, "I never delighted much in contemplating commas and colons, or in spelling or measuring syllables. But now, if I attempt to look at these little objects, I find my imagination, in spite of all my exertions, roaming in the Milky Way, among the nebulae, those mighty orbs and stupendous orbits of suns, planets, satellites, and comets, which compose the incomprehensible universe. And if I do not sink into nothing in my own estimation, I feel an irresistible impulse to fall on my knees in adoration of the power that moves, the wisdom that directs, and the benevolence that sanctifies this wonderful whole." Well, this is a stirring passage, particularly to someone who teaches grammar, and moving insight into the heart of that great statesman. But it is also applicable to our speaker tonight, because she delights in the microscopic, she worships the Creator, and she also has an affection for long sentences. That was about 100 words. Like Adam, she delights in meditating on the details of our lives and language, and in her books, she cares for words, and for the silences even, that punctuates those words. Her book, Christ My Companion, is an exposition of the great hymn, St. Patrick's Breastplate, and her book is in fact a meditation on the humble preposition. And if you've never thought about prepositions very much, I encourage you to look at that one. It's remarkable. And then she also talks about phrases in Scripture. Instead of trying to read whole passages at a time, she said take short phrases, and she introduces us to some and meditates on those for a time. She's got a precision of mind and a focused attention that is in fact daunting. My wife, Karen, and I had the privilege of attending a conference in which she spoke. I was also a participant. And Karen remarked to me how terrifying it must be as a speaker to finish the talk and then to see Marilyn raise her hand afterwards. But she's got a heart that is large to match her mind. And this is expressed in her ministry to the dying and their caregivers. Her most recent book, Faithful Farewell, has just come out, and then she's got another one that's coming out tomorrow. Is it the next few days? Yes. So that's a part of her writing I've not been privileged to read, but I'm looking forward to that. She cares about connecting spirituality, politics, food, health care, care for the earth and its creatures, care for language and public discourse, and finding new ways to live together on a planet that needs healing. This wide range of interests is expressed in her conversation. She's a lively and provocative conversationalist. While commiserating about the difficulty of finding time with children whose in-laws seem to claim all the juicy holidays for family reunions, she said, well, we just created our own. We're going to celebrate Shakespeare's birthday. And if she gets home, flies home, she'll just have time to clean her house to have the children in for his birthday this weekend. In this art, she's joined by her husband, John, who's accompanied her whose description of God's gifts has stuck with me over several years. He said, "You receive them wrapped in barbed wire sometimes, and when you open them, you discover a hand grenade." They had just returned from Italy, where they jointly taught a course on Dante's Divine Comedy, and I can't imagine anything more delightful than being their students in that. I just begun discovering her poetry in the little book, The Color of Light, a reflection on Van Gogh's later paintings. And if I could, if you'd indulge me, just to read a little portion of Van Gogh's bedroom. Just what you need in a room: a window tall enough for poplars, bright with borrowed green, crookedness and color enough to keep the eye entertained. You need a pitcher and pegs, and an empty vase ready for sunflowers or irises when you can get them. And a mirror for truth. Every day delivers its ephemeral record of change like headlines. Unshaven artist finds new hope. Old lost leaves belated mar. New shades come out at first light. You need angles and corners, and a floor rough enough to help the feet remember the oddities of earth. Well, I could go on in my enthusiasm. This is the temptation of one who's aging and of a teacher, and those are lethal combinations, I must say. But I spend most of my days talking about people who, writers who are dead and gone, but our writer today is most alive and well, and I certainly want to welcome her, and ask you to join me in welcoming Marilyn McEntyre.
Thank you, that was a really nice introduction. It is such a pleasure to be here. Can you all hear me? This is good. And I'm especially honored to be asked to be the last speaker in this series. I know that this community has gone through an enormous loss this year, and I hope in my words to honor Dale and his great efforts and the legacy that he leaves, and also to honor the students who are here, some of whom are graduating, because what I plan to talk with you about tonight is something I know Dale cared about, we care about. I'm also an aging teacher. I really care about education, and specifically about the role of the liberal arts in what's next. We were given this question at the beginning of this long series, what's next? It's such an open question. Of course, it's a question that can inspire dread, it can be threatening, or it's a question that can inspire a lot of hope and anticipation. But when I think about preparing for what's next, being of a dark turn of mind, I think about a lot of the ways the world is facing unprecedented crises. And what do we need to face these crises? And a lot of people will tell you we need technological innovation. We need people who are going into the sciences and math, which we certainly do. But one somewhat counterintuitive answer to that question, what do we need for what's next, for what we're all facing in the world in the next decades, is the liberal arts. And the liberal arts are having a hard time at a lot of colleges. They don't promise work. They don't have immediate financial reward attached to them mostly. But they are what I would call equipment for living. I got that phrase from Kenneth Burke, who's one of my favorite literary critics. He says literature is equipment for living. And I would extend that to literature, history, the social sciences, the fine arts. These things are equipment for living. They're equipment for living at a time like this. Craig mentioned that John and I just finished teaching a course in Dante. And we told them at the beginning of the course that one of the questions we wanted to address was, why read Dante at a time like this? It is not a question that has an obvious answer. And it's actually a question that came from a hapless econ major many years ago who had to take an English course to finish her degree, and she, unfortunately, the only one that fit into her schedule was my upper division poetry course. So she came, and about 3 weeks into the course, she came into my office hours and kind of shuffled her feet and said, I don't want to be impertinent, but why do people do this? And I thought, you know, it's a good question. Why would you spend hours of your life reflecting on poetry and, you know, looking at commas and semicolons, analyzing why someone made a line break where he or she did? And so, in response, I wrote a talk that I gave a number of places, and it's become an interesting question for me. Why read Chaucer at a time like this? Why go to a modern art museum? Why do any of these things? The why question is a good thing to address. Well, back to the larger question of why do the liberal arts, I want to begin with a reflection I wrote years ago when I was doing a series of little postcards with lists. One of the lists was things every adult should be able to do. And this list included a number of practical skills, which were change a tire, make a soup from scratch, teach a child to read. And some of the items on the list were perhaps less practical, but more important to a life richly lived. Recite a poem, argue without fighting, imagine why somebody might like opera. The fun of making this list was choosing from among the range of competencies and habits of mind I'd recognized over the years in many adults whose lives I hope to emulate. Most of the items on the list, with the possible exception of changing a tire, are in some way a function of a liberal arts education, since most of them involve more than a set of prescribed procedures designed to yield a predictable result. Most of them involve some degree of assimilation, invention, imagination, empathy, reflection, discernment, and choice. Let me pause over those words for a moment and read them again. Each of these words seems to me a faculty or a skill that those whose enhancement is one of the primary objectives of a liberal arts education. Assimilation, being able to assimilate the information that comes to you. Invention, imagination, empathy. I work these days with medical students, and we spend a lot of time talking about the question of whether empathy can be learned and taught. Reflection, discernment, and choice. I'd like this evening to consider with you another list of what I take to be 6 essential habits of mind or life skills for which the liberal arts prepare and equip us, and how each of these serves not only our personal growth, but also the social good, and the measures we can take as educators, administrators, adult citizens, and Christians for whom faith and education both matter, to help develop them. What all 6 of these have in common is that they foster participation rather than simply individual satisfaction or self-fulfillment. They foster versatility, generosity, and restraint, 3 qualities that are urgently needed in leaders who truly wish to be public servants at a difficult time. So here's the first one. A liberal arts education teaches us to think about process. I have told a number of students over the years, if I could only give you one thing in your 4 years of college, it would be the habit of thinking about process. That is, to see everything, every manufactured object, every living thing, every idea, in terms of the processes that brought it into being, designed it, sustained it, control it, and change it. To see in terms of the real costs and trade-offs involved in its production. To see it in terms of its intended purposes and whose intentions define those purposes and its inadvertent effects. One easy example is look at any building you're sitting in. Somebody designed it, somebody decided how big it needed to be, somebody decided how much they were going to be able to spend on it, somebody decided on materials. All of these things are worth considering. And so I think what we need to, the shift we need to make and try to make in a liberal arts education is to move from thinking in nouns to thinking in verbs. Everything is a function of a process. Thoreau claimed that we only understand a thing rightly if we see it under the aspect of time. That is, if we understand its life cycle, or its seasons, or its patterns of growth and decay. In other words, its story. When we look out the window at a tree, for instance, or across the aisle at another human being, we are catching the tree or the human being at a specific moment in long, complex histories. When I look out at you, I think every one of you is at a moment in your story. And here we are in each other's presence for one lovely moment together, and then we'll go on with those stories. But it's important to remember that this night falls at a different place in each person's story. What you see isn't what you get. What you see is a kaleidoscope that's paused in its turning to reveal a design that will shift with the next rotation. It might increase our reverence for each other if we practice seeing each other in just this way, as creatures in whom the play of emerging purposes and possibilities is constantly opening into new configurations. The way Wendell Berry saw a place and a human being when he wrote this portion of one of the poems I love. I go amazed into the maze of a design that mind can follow but not know. Apparent, plain, and yet unknown. Be still. A man who seems to be a gardener rises out of the ground, stands like a tree, shakes off the dark, the bluebells opening at his feet, the light one-figured cloth of song. To see each other and all that is around us in terms of the processes and forces at work lays a foundation for hope and compassion and forgiveness. Berry's understanding of the light, which is manifest in living beings and surrounds them as one-figured cloth of song, directs our attention to the primal energies that are at work in us and among us, which we may call, not only metaphorically, light and love. So the habit of thinking in terms of processes, theological, economic, ecological, linguistic, historical, does not come naturally, at least not to speakers of a language that's so dominated by nouns. Focusing our attention on things and products, and victims of a public discourse that's dominated by abstractions. Listen to any political speech, and how many of those words end in T-I-O-N, N-E-S-S, M-E-N-T, abstractions that really have nothing behind them. I wrote a piece one time that I quite enjoyed writing called The Sin of Abstraction. Seeing things in terms of process requires shifting our emphasis then to verbs, to see things as happening. Each one of us here is something happening. It is tempting, if you foreground the noun, to see persons, places, and things as solid, given, and fixed. If I see the chair in my study as a mere thing, I see it in utilitarian and perhaps aesthetic terms, perhaps in terms of what it cost me on sale at OfficeMax. But it takes an extra pause for reflection also to see it in terms, say, of how the materials of which it is made were cultivated, mined, manufactured, how it was transported, how it was marketed, and with what impact on people and land. Its history involves a complex mix of competing values that deserve periodic reassessment. Seeing in terms of process is a discipline that invites questions that lead us into various disciplinary territories: ethics, ecology, economics, language study, history, sociology, psychology, biology, botany. Sounds like a college catalog. Bringing questions to bear from each of those, our decisions about what chair to buy and how to own it and use it responsibly become more complicated, more interesting, and more invested in the common good. Think about that when you go buy your next chair. A number of websites that encourage socially responsible production, marketing, and consumption rate corporations in terms of criteria such as these: the health impacts of their processes, sustainability and effects on ecosystems, transparency, treatment of labor, effects on communities and local cultures. Assessing what we buy or use in this conscientious, reflective way requires exactly the kind of systematic analysis, patience, tolerance for ambiguity, and interest in connecting dots that general education programs need to teach, and the best of them do teach. So here's a second habit of mind or life skill we might expect from a liberal arts education. That is the capacity in assessing any problem or decision to frame, reframe, and step outside the frame. That we all see and construe the world from within limited frames of reference is a truth we might miss if some teacher hadn't pointed out that what we thought were universal truths or natural behaviors were, in fact, deeply culturally embedded and rooted in the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves as recipients of a particular parcel of land and legacy of ideas. There's nothing wrong with cultural embeddedness. In fact, it's as inevitable as biological constraints that come with bodies. I spend time regularly exploring with medical and pre-med students the fact that even illness, which most of us are conditioned to think of in strictly biomedical terms, is partially but significantly socially constructed. We learn how to be sick. We learn in the culture we live in what's considered healthy, how much pain to put up with, what appropriate treatment looks like, and in what ways body, mind, and spirit might be related. Medicine in any culture is a culture. Medicalization thresholds differ from one country to another. They say that in England, they do less of everything in clinics. You put up with a lot of pain. It's related to the stiff upper lip ethic that's part of English culture. Notions of personal and professional responsibility for health and healing differ from one culture to another. Food and drug regulations differ. All of these dimensions of illness located within conceptual frames that can and should be critically examined. And our classrooms should be labs where we learn to do that. Training students in critical thinking, which has become something of a buzzword, means acquainting them with the different disciplinary methods and strategies that come into play when any policy or practice is being considered. Trying, for instance, to figure out who pays for health care, we need to reflect on how we frame illness, health, and healing, how we define disability, what food is served to children in public schools, what constitutes elder abuse, who makes end-of-life decisions. Every definition, every protocol, every regulation, every transaction takes place within structures that become normative and invisible, and therefore more susceptible to abuse if we don't create a population who are willing to keep re-examining those basic definitions, assumptions, and purposes. In other words, people who are capable of questioning the obvious and raise those questions. We commonly speak of the framers of the Constitution as architects, recognizing in that document the structures in which we seek shelter and survival as a nation. They knew, however, that what they were doing was one among a number of ways governments could be designed. Perhaps no one knew this better than Jefferson, who wrote toward the end of his long life, and I believe this is on the Jefferson Memorial. If you go to DC, you can see these words. I am not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and constitutions, but laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, and manners and opinions change, with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him as a boy, as a civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. Think of the humility of a man like Jefferson lumping himself in with our barbarous ancestors. But also to recommend at the end of his long and fruitful life in state building that we let go of all of his work when the time was right for a change. To recognize the contingency of this most significant and hard-won piece of Jefferson's life work, and to suggest such a radical reframing of political infrastructure as a condition of social health took exactly the kind of imagination we would hope to foster in a liberal arts education. It also required the capacity to step outside the frames of reference that he himself inhabited, and to imagine conditions under which his own best work might become inadequate or irrelevant. That takes enormous humility and intellectual honesty, two virtues we also hope to foster in our students. Examining our own assumptions is tricky. It's a little like trying to get a 3D view of yourself in multiple mirrors. But it's a necessary defense against the insidious downward pull toward insularity, ideological dogmatism, and bigotry. One can do it with some fairly simple questions, regularly applied. Why do I think that? What evidence am I relying on? I'm smiling because a colleague of mine has a sign on his office door that says, "Don't believe everything you think." Why do I think that? What evidence am I relying on? What am I assuming? What point of view do I tend to resist or suspect or discount? What might I find out if even for a little while I tried on that point of view? Reframing takes audacity and flexibility and generosity and imagination. I think of the story of a rabbi who, when a young man came to him celebrating a victory, asked, "How do you know it's not a disaster?" And when another came lamenting a defeat, asked him, "How do you know it's not a blessing?" To be able, in the peaks and troughs, to ask those counterintuitive questions is to help develop a necessary resiliency for surviving the profound changes we face together. Climate change, loss of biodiversity, poverty and its multiple causes, political gridlock, and the mixed blessing of pervasive electronic connectedness. We need people who can consider precisely how blessing might be wrung from what look like doomsday scenarios, and others who are able to speak a prophetic word to the complacent and the comfortable. Those who have read and discussed the Divine Comedy, say, or the Federalist Papers, or Moby Dick, or Franklin's remarks concerning the savages of North America, or Darwin's Origin of Species, or Newton's Principia Mathematica, that's a very small club, or the book of Isaiah, will be the best equipped for those necessary tasks. All right, here's a third habit of mind, or skill, we have a right to expect from a liberal arts education. That is the capacity to raise pertinent and impertinent questions. We've already touched on this since questions are reframing devices. But let's consider more specifically the notion that what students ought to carry out the doors with them on graduation day, besides a diploma, is a repertoire of questions that will serve as templates and tools in any site of decision-making or discernment. One of the things I remind students regularly is they're basically 6 question words: who, what, when, where, how, and why. Just ask one of them every time you get a chance. It has continued to surprise me over decades of teaching that raising questions rarely comes naturally, or at least that the natural tendency of small children to raise honest and inappropriate questions seems alarmingly often either to have been flattened into compliancy among the polite, or to have hardened into ideological posturing among the rebellious by the time they reach college. Any of us who have paused after presenting what we supposed was provocative material and asked any questions, only to find ourselves treading water in an expanding pool of silence, may have asked ourselves why it's so hard to evoke questions. Apart from the obvious answer that 18 to 22-year-olds are often driven into shyness by fears of social rejection or anxiety about looking stupid, the reasons why people don't raise questions are worth considering. After all, as I've said, there are only 6 question words, and variants including the powerful test question, "So what?" That's a really key question on a paper. You would think that we could keep these words handy, like change in our pockets, and pull them out easily every time we meet a new fact or a statistic. And this is an exercise I used to give my classes, just walk in with a fact and say, all right, raise some questions about this fact. So they just have to get used to, you know, who said so, why did it come up at a time like this, where did that come from, and so on. But a questioning habit of mind is easily lost in environments of regimentation or judgment or prescribed curriculum and programmed learning. We may forget standing there at the front of the classroom asking if there are any questions. The questions are volatile and scary, and they lead us into uncharted territory that's littered with landmines. For questions to flourish, they have to sprout in protected space, like shoots that need to be nurtured in pots before being transplanted and exposed to the elements. What's on the test feels safe. What if manifest destiny was a handy way of legitimating genocide? Doesn't feel safe. When I think about questions I've admired, I think sometimes of Basil Rathbone's Sherlock Holmes, who would, do you remember him? Anybody old enough here to remember Basil Rathbone? He would enter a room, look around, and see something slightly out of place. And he'd cry, "Hello, what's this?" Or I think of Oliver Sacks, whose work I've taught with delight for years. He's for those of you who don't know him, hasten out and buy his work and read it. But he's a neurologist who has a remarkable relational approach to the practice of medicine, working mostly with people who can't be cured, but who can be helped. His puzzlement and his wonder is a defining characteristic of his clinical practice. His basic approach to patients begins not just with the questions necessary for differential diagnosis, but questions like, who are you? What's it like to be you? How do you experience or understand or cope with your condition? How can I help you do that? They're beautiful questions that lead him and his patients into collaboration in healing. Or I think of Thoreau's willingness to question what seemed obvious or unassailable. If you remember from Walden, he raises the question, what is a house? Why practice philanthropy? How may the railroad or anything else we call progress be a Pyrrhic victory? These are still applicable questions. Questions ought to sprout in climates of free inquiry like grass in the rain, but they require explicit permission. They require some training in methods and the leisure to pursue questions meaningfully. Joseph Pieper's little classic, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, reminds us that the leisure required for and afforded by the privilege of a liberal arts education is necessary not simply for the pleasure of the privileged, but for the common good. Since what we're cultivating in those costly protected times and spaces are the questions that no constitutional democracy or free people can afford to stop asking. Questions like how and where are decisions being made? Who is funding the research and services we depend on? What trade-offs are we accepting when we choose not to require conversion to sustainable fuels? When has poverty reached the tipping point that turns beggars into revolutionaries? Where have spirituality and medicine converged most powerfully? Why do news media present such wildly differing narratives of public life? The list of questions like this, of course, is endless. The trick is to keep doing it, to make questioning a habit, to be willing to make it an annoying habit, and then to listen for answers and consider them, and then ask the next question and recognize when one has sufficient information to act on. Apropos asking the next question, I should say that several years ago, a friend and I, a colleague and I, taught an experimental little one-unit course for undergraduates called Conversational English for Native Speakers. The trick was to try to retrieve the art of conversation for people who had been afflicted with the media paralysis that comes from too many sitcoms. But one of the assignments was to ask the next question. Just, when someone tells you something, ask them something. It's a good exercise. I recommend it. The habit of questioning we hope to foster might start, of course, by looking around and wondering about the very institutions in which we encourage it, about curriculum design, about the evolution and utility of the disciplines we inscribe in curricular design, about the methods of assessment, about which many of us who are faculty have raised many questions in recent years, about the architecture, about the tensions between the monastic roots of the university and the economic forces at work that turn liberal arts colleges into businesses. These questions are worth raising regularly and vigorously if we're interested in creating adaptive, resilient environments that can equip students for the world they're getting. It's a good place to start. So here's a fourth habit of mind, or a skill that we need from liberal arts education to serve the social good, that we hope the people who go out from colleges like this one will serve the social good. That is the capacity to tolerate and even embrace ambiguity and paradox. The liberally educated ought to be trained in what Keats called negative capability. That is, as he defined it, the capacity of the poetic mind to dwell in ambiguity without straining after resolution. I'm going to say that again because it's Keats' definition and not mine. It's really worth repeating. It's the capacity of the poetic mind to dwell in ambiguity without straining after resolution. Some of our worst social problems can be traced to an undue desire for resolution. The apparent security of closure, closed borders, closed systems, fixed racial or diagnostic or political categories, or a rush to regulation or policy making when a little more pondering might work to broader and longer-term purposes. Consider the difference between theologians who are willing to wrestle with the complexities of a living word that speaks in multiple genres from multiple cultures and supports various possible readings, and those who seem driven to nail it down and reduce it to a set of rules, principles, and univocal interpretations that brook no differences. Or consider the difference between English teachers who insist on the crushing proprieties of the 5-paragraph essay and those who admit that there are as many ways to write well as there are ways, as my grandfather put it, to skin a cat. My grandpa was from North Carolina, so it's really fun to be here. Certainly those of us who work in the context of Christian liberal arts education need to take seriously the implications of following one who taught in parables and loved paradox, and seemed to rely on purposeful confusion as a pedagogical tool when he taught his followers to release themselves from Levitical law into something broader and sturdier and more life-giving than fixed formulae and applications. To do so involved a good many impertinent questions, unsettling surprises, and not a few radical reframings. If you want to save your life, lose it. That has wide applications, as does happy are those who mourn. Or, I might say, whose head is on the coin? Give Caesar what is Caesar's, and God what is God's. You figure out what is Caesar's and what is God's. Negative capability offers fairly reliable protection against bigotry. If one works from the premise that the answer to most questions that matter is yes and no, or it depends, one may find that those answers provide a solid foundation for good critical reasoning. Do we embrace the Second Amendment? Yes and no. Depends on whether one believes the right to bear arms is confined to what is necessary for a well-regulated militia for public protection, or whether one thinks the writer's idea of arms can be legitimately extended to include Uzis and M16s in the hands of any 18-year-old with enough cash to buy them. Should GMOs be labeled? Banned? That depends on how one defines genetic modification. Who's opposing the labeling and why? And who's funding the longitudinal research on the effects of genetically modified crops? And what does Eliot mean when he writes, teach us to care and not to care? Teach us to sit still. Speaking from my own discipline, I find literature an apt and necessary training ground for this particular habit of mind, teaching us to dwell in and honor the ambiguities. Teaching us, as I have put it elsewhere, that the gray area is holy ground. It's where we live. Since Eliot came to mind, let me cite him again on this matter. In Little Gidding, he writes, there are 3 conditions which often look alike, yet differ completely, flourish in the same hedgerow. Attachment to self and to things and to persons. Detachment from self and from things and from persons. And, growing between them, indifference, which resembles the others as death resembles life. How what we think of as opposites may be interdependent and even contiguous. How a spectrum may really be a circle. How paradox may be the only adequate way to tell the whole truth is a matter that every wisdom tradition, certainly that represented in the Gospels, invites us to wrestle with. How the way up is the way down. How time and space are not separate dimensions, but a continuum. How wealth becomes a kind of impoverishment, and progress a form of loss. How eternity is not duration, but absolute and ultimate nowness. How the kingdom of heaven is already among us. If we're going to educate for the common good, we have to include in that education some training in the courage to accept incompletion. I actually wrote a piece one time on called In Praise of Incompletion, and I got 3 fan letters immediately. People were grateful to be given permission to be incomplete. So we need to include in education some training in the courage to accept incompletion, the humility to recognize how often the opposite is also true, the audacity to entertain conflicting possibilities, and the farsightedness that can foresee a paradigm shift. Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, by the way, although it's sadly in need of a more compelling title, would go on my required reading list for every liberal arts student. Reading that book would prevent trivial use of the term paradigm shift and help them prepare for the one many of us, I think, for the one many of us think is coming. We are facing a massive paradigm shift, more than one. What I hope we're modeling for students and asking of them is to consider every paper, every experiment, every original idea, even the marketable ones, as contributions to an ongoing conversation whose origins and ends lie beyond our vision, and whose purposes and outcomes we can't fully fathom. Only certain kinds of outcomes can be measured. Let me say that again to the administrators and educators present. Only certain kinds of outcomes can be measured. And for those of you who aren't getting the reference, inside most institutions now there's something of a vigorous debate about how much of our time to spend measuring outcomes. Surely a truth to bear firmly in mind as we try to assess the value of what we do is that what matters can't always be measured. And what can be measured doesn't always matter. The wisdom of teaching in parables that need parsing and in beatitudes that upend common sense and deft questions that defeat Pharisees and legalists, questions like whose head is on the coin, is to keep us from becoming victims to our own laws and judgments, and the dream of safety that, as Auden puts it, drives us to the securities of legalism. Our dream of safety has to disappear, one of his poems begins. And that poem ends with, look if you like, but you will have to leap. We always leap into the unknown. We always act on insufficient evidence. and to know that, and to leap and to act anyway, is what I would hope for as a result of an adequate liberal arts education. A fifth feature of liberal arts education that will contribute to the social good is that it teaches us to read, interpret, and translate. Good reading is strenuous and slow and subjective and mysterious. It requires sufficient versatility to entertain variant readings of a single poem or play or legal document or creedal statement. Good reading requires some attention to subtlety and subtext, active construction and deconstruction of successive interpretive horizons. The interpretive horizon is what you think you know at any given point in your reading of a narrative. And you have to keep revising that as you move through the narrative because now you have more information. But reading is not a linear process. You move forward a little and then you have to reassess everything you thought you already had. And in new terms. Good reading requires an awareness of words as magnetic fields of meaning, or charged particles, say, that carry the weight of cultural history and current usage and personal association, and sometimes recombine in idiosyncratic or explosive ways. That words do things to each other. They don't just lie there on the page. Good reading requires a willingness to slow down enough for the kind of close reading that yields rewards only the slow can reap. One of the pleasures in being in Orvieto with the Gordon program this last month is that we were at the center of the slow food movement in Italy. And there are other movements that have followed across the world. I think, for instance, apropos slow reading, of an hour and a half I spent one evening with a group of unusually willing graduate students on 1.5-page sentence in Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom. You're right, Craig, I really do like long sentences. They give you a lot to navigate. They're kind of like mazes. That every reading is an act of interpretation, and that every act of writing is an act of translation, should be obvious to those who work with words, which is to say, everyone involved in the liberal arts. Visual artists and musicians know this perhaps better than those of us who deal mostly in text. The score is not the music. The listener and the viewer are involved in producing the spark that happens when art meets life, as is the reader of the poem. Your version of Frost's After Apple Picking is not the same as mine. One of my favorite exercises for pre-med students, and by the way, I keep referring to med students because much of my work these days is with med students and pre-med students in a field called medical humanities. It's really fun to play around in other people's disciplinary terms. So one of my favorite exercises for pre-med students is to ask them to explain a complex biochemical process for two audiences. Once for a high school student taking life science for the first time, and once for a patient who's afraid and who has to make a life-altering decision. And then we talk about the difference between simplifying and dumbing down, between condescending to an audience and tailoring the message to what you believe they need to know. They have to come up with at least one illustrative analogy. For example, the digestive system is a little like plumbing. Show how it might help someone understand a process, and then explain its limitations. It's really not much like plumbing. It's much more complicated than that. In fact, the plumbing analogy can lead to some serious underestimation of what it means to remove a colon. Pre-law students need to wrestle with the meanings of bitterly disputed phrases like the right to bear arms, or freedom of speech, which now apparently includes freedom to pour a great deal of money into the election process. Religious studies majors need to be willing to consider the riches of midrash and what difference the differences make between one Bible translation and another. In the application, for instance, of a commandment, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder. The 20 scholars who worked on the NRSV translation spent 3 days arguing over that difference. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder. I don't remember which one they came out with, do you?
Thou shalt not. Thou shalt not. I think it's. I don't know. I have my own interpretation. I think that's what I think.
Well, since they were split down the middle, I think we all get to vote. Psychology students need to consider the rampant implications of the ways the DSM-5 names and circumscribes particular mental illnesses. How we identify autism, for instance, or bipolar disorder, or depression. As some of you know, the definition of autism has now shrunk, the autistic spectrum, which has enormous implications for insurance and for parents of children with autism. A review of E.D. Hirsch's widely read book, Validity and Interpretation, calls interpretation, quote, a discipline that is fundamental to virtually all humanistic studies. I would take virtually out of that sentence. I don't believe we can read or even look without interpreting. As Melville demonstrated with some hilarity in the doubloon chapter of Moby Dick, which you may recall, it's chapter 99, where each crew member does his own characteristic and self-interested interpretation of the images on the Spanish doubloon that Ahab has nailed to a mast as a reward for the one who first sights the whale, a creature whose significance is similarly weirdly negotiable. The readings end with little Pitt's pregnant babbling. He goes up to the doubloon and he says, I look, you look, he looks, we look, ye look, they look, as though that settles the matter. In other words, the observer changes the data. The phobia, the I, is not, as poet Richard Wilbur reminds us, the prime composer. What we see is not what we get. Nor is the light we see by. Sometimes, as Röpke reminds us, it is in the dark that the eye begins to see. Reading with all our faculties, not just with a set of academic tools, but with awareness of the personal histories we bring to our readings, of our own inclinations and needs and resistances. Reading with the humility that fosters willingness to be surprised. Reading with an ear to others' readings, and with a prayer that we might be given what we need for this moment of encounter with this text, prepares us for the gifts that come only to the receptive, whose readings are not efforts to prove or affirm, so much as invitations to the Spirit to speak, and to the unconscious to mingle its rich dream material with the trove of stories we're given to live by. We're always learning to read. And as I tell my students, every new author, every new text you embark on is teaching you something new about how to read. The sixth thing a liberal arts education equips us with, I think, is empathy, a capacity to empathize. As I've said, in the medical school where I now teach humanities to the very preoccupied, there is much conversation among clinical skills faculty about whether empathy can be taught. For those who are going to work with people who are suffering, the question is urgent and practical, as well as complicated by competing notions of what professionalism means. We've all heard the jokes about Clinton's ill-timed word of intended comfort, I feel your pain. One might rightly bristle at such a glib reassurance. We don't feel each other's pain. But we can, and we must, imagine it, and imagine each other's point of view. Cultivating an active, generous curiosity for points of view we find alien or puzzling or downright repugnant, at least enough to shift the emphasis from why would you think that to why would you think that? And to listen for an answer, and to be willing to be surprised, is one of the responsibilities a liberal arts education both confers and enables. I've told many of my literature classes, good literature is written and read in the service of compassion. If I didn't think that to be fundamentally true, I wouldn't be up here waving this book around. I'd probably be doing something much more lucrative and less important. The ensuing explanation is simply that stories, and this includes the stories about others' lives we hear in history courses, or religious studies, or anthropology, or biology, invite us to inhabit or identify with other points of view, to consider how people arrive at their curious conclusions or ill-advised decisions, how anger might actually mask pain or arrogance, insecurity, and how greed and aggression might actually have their roots in fear. A liberal arts education equips us for empathy by insisting on seeing things in context, recognizing what we have to do with creating those contexts, and on recognizing how roads diverge in the yellow wood and how way leads on to way. It equips us by honoring the work of the imagination and the power and value of the hypothetical question. Why might she have done that? What might be the mitigating factors? What pressures might she be under? And pausing long enough to ask these questions before arriving at our judgments is a habit that can serve the cause of justice in small but significant ways every day, in every transaction. To encourage these habits of mind and others, we need institutions that are spacious, slow, and subversive. By which I mean institutions that resist the momentum of the marketplace and the hegemony of productivity, that like the slow food movement hold out for quality rather than quantity, and relational learning rather than purveying education as a commodity. Institutions that make it their business to impede the slide down the slippery slope from novel to normal to normative. We need people who keep one foot outside any institution they're in and insist on the meta-conversation about the terms in which we couch our objectives and the structures we inhabit that both enable and impede the work we most hope to do. T.S. Eliot wrote, "The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless." Humility is the ground of empathy and a prerequisite to all learning. It is the wisdom we can't afford to cease pursuing or praying for as we attempt to maintain a rich sense of vocation in a climate of competition that lures us further and further into a marketplace not of ideas but of calculated costs and benefits. Humility is what will enable empathy, and empathy, compassion, and compassion, generous policymaking that may finally make for a peace that these days may seem to be more than we can hope for. We are in the business of maintaining that hope. We can only do so if we remember what we are about and whom we serve, and that your good and my good are inseparable because they're the same. Thank you. Okay.
Marilyn will be happy to answer questions that you might have. So please.
Are there any questions?
Don't dare be silent.
There are only 6. I know it's late, so don't feel compelled to stay. I want to give you a chance to ask questions. Yeah.
So I think it was one of the first habits of mine that described as being honest with concept.
Of process, yes.
And not that I need this to be reconciled. I'll do it okay if it's no resolution, but this idea of tolerance of ambiguity, which I think is important too.
The idea,
Tolerance of ambiguity.
yes.
Would you want to try to reconcile those two? Or is it separate in terms of?
To be mindful of process and tolerance of ambiguity, how are they at odds?
Well, that's the question that some people might say that process-oriented, you want black and white or flow chart. And I don't think that's what you mean.
No.
First blush.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting thought, though it hadn't occurred to me that it might be heard that way. When I say being mindful of process, I simply mean that everything involves a process, and that if we see an object and don't think about where it came from, or that it has a story, if we just treat it, as I said, as a noun or a thing, then we don't see our purchase of that thing, for instance, as participation in a series of processes that need themselves to be examined. So, the easiest example is the one I gave about the chair. If you look at it in terms of who made it and designed it and marketed it and so on, you might start to ask some questions about the labor practices of this company, or the sustainability of these materials and so on. That's what I meant about process. But you're right, people can try to lock down process with maps and flowcharts in ways that become stultifying. Yes, ma'am?
The title of your talk is Habits of Mind for a Liberal Arts Education. Would you be able to retitle that, substitute something else for the liberal arts education? Because the habits of mind...
For the liberally educated?
it just seems to apply to...
It applies to everything.
Living a full...
Habits of mind for civilized adults.
Yeah.
Actually, the title I gave originally was Equipment for Living.
Yes.
And I love that idea that literature and that the liberal arts in general offer us equipment for living. But yeah, I don't think this is restricted, certainly not to people with college educations, and some of the most compassionate people I know don't have that. But I certainly think that those of us who are involved in liberal arts education need to consider whither education, speaking of what next, what directions higher education is taking, and where we might want to put the brakes on long enough to slow ourselves down and think of what trade-offs we're facing. Because there's enormous pressure to make all higher education utilitarian. And it needs to be within that.
Process, a very interesting concept in itself, of course. One long pondered by the ancients as well. And Alfred North Whitehead's Process and Reality. He speaks of looking at a table, not as a solid object, but as an event
Yes.
of submicroscopic movements taking place. It strikes me, and I appreciate your thought on this, that if one moves in that direction, we move into a poetic knowledge as well as the appraisal of its work.
Did everyone hear the question? That Whitehead talked about a table as an event, just in that if you think in that way, you're moving into the realm of what you're calling, or Whitehead calling, poetic.
Well, I would identify that as the question. Is that not a much a poetic sense of reality as it is a philosophical?
It is if you think of physics as a form of poetry. Yes, I think that poetic knowledge is essentially a knowledge that synthesizes and that connects dots and that sees in terms of possibility. But it's also true that all those atoms are in movement. The things we call solid are more air than matter. So all the things we learn from physics really do tend to move us in that poetic direction. And I wasn't really kidding about thinking of physics as a form of poetry. If you've read Fritjof Capra's The Tao of Physics, he talks about the convergences between physics and ancient philosophy and Buddhism and so on. But physics really takes us to a place of having to think poetically. Otherwise they wouldn't come up with words like quark and charm. Well, I'm aware that it's late, so let's call it a night, and what a delight to be with you all. Thank you.